Sorry, I'm here again. Double duty. So I'm going to say a few things about N plus one, the magazine. Lisa is an editor on. When I was beginning to think of myself as a writer, I started reading. I and a group, along with a group of young writers, we were journalists at the Times of India, and we were looking for these avenues that made us think. We were looking for new, fresh writing and new voices. And N plus one suddenly it presented itself, as it were, and I looked at it as though I'd made a great literary discovery. This was in 2009, I think. Although by that point, N plus one was already a well-regarded magazine. A lot of people were reading it. A lot of people were sort of major writers were contributing to it. So it was there was something about it was easy to kind of connect with that magazine. Maybe because there is something inherently cosmopolitan about a little magazine. It has an international appeal, and the editors don't have to do much, which is in contrast to the big establishment magazines, which sometimes have a provincialism of a sort built into the name. It begins with the name, like the New Yorker, which is sort of catering to the community, the local community, and maybe this was the spirit that animated writers like Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, who founded his magazine, a little magazine called Damn You, inspired by a New York magazine called Fuck You. And this Damn You was published from Allahabad, and it went on for 6 issues, I think, before it shut down. So these connections are made when we're talking about little magazines, and these are made quite frequently and very easily. In regard to N plus one, the thing that I mostly still enjoy and greatly enjoyed at that time, the unsigned editorials that N plus one published, and the irreverent tone of those editorials. Almost every editorial is a kind of an attack. It's the intention is to invite trouble. I really like that, and the first issue, I think, includes an editorial, I think 2004. The first issue, number 1, includes an editorial against the New Republic. And the editors call out the New Republic for its conservative ideas having to do with literary criticism, the conservative brand of literary criticism. And James Wood, the critic, comes in for a drubbing in that piece. One of the lines that has stayed with me is that James Wood wants to be his own grandfather. The references to Wood's preference for a particular kind of 19th century realism. That's what they claim the editors make, and Wood sprang up in defense. There's only one paragraph about Wood in that editorial, but it was enough to elicit a 2,500 response by James Wood, published in the same magazine, in which Wood rehearses. It's a very interesting piece, that one, and Wood rehearses some of the ideas that occur in his later work. But it also includes a backhanded kind of an endorsement to N plus one. Wood says that I like the spirit of the magazine, he says, despite the belligerence of its editors. So Lisa Borst has been among the custodians of that spirit since 2019. She's a web editor on N plus one, as well as a member of the admin staff. Which requires a lot of emailing and Zoom meetings, as we were discussing. So she's also a writer. She's been published in N plus one and elsewhere. And some of her concerns overlap with our own here, having to do with how market forces are shaping literature, shaping even the literary sensibility of writers. So she's going to, I hope, touch upon some of these ideas in her talk. And over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much. Hi. Thanks. This is great. This has been very amazing. It's like, I'm not an academic, and so it's sort of a rare treat to hear this sort of thing. But because of that, I hope you'll sort of excuse my prosaic approach. I sort of wrote this as a kind of experiment in generality, as we were discussing earlier. So it's not not much of a close reading, but a sort of attempt at like a bottom-up feeling out of what's going on in writing right now in America. Okay. Essentially, all the texts I read about the premise of our symposium, that is about the uneasy relationships between literary study and creative writing, the origins of their disaffiliation, and the present consequences for a generation of writers, for whom, as David Foster Wallace wrote back in 1988, Salinger invented the wheel, Updike internal combustion, and Carver, Beatty, and Phillips drive. Everything I read about this focused on the US university as the site of the problem. More specifically, they trained their gaze on the benighted location of the contemporary English department. This focus was so pervasive that in reading some recent dispatches from the academic literary sphere, I began to encounter the same spatial metaphor again and again. In his study of the post-war rise of American creative writing, The Program Era, which is a tremendous book of like materialist criticism, Mark McGurl describes the sneering war between creative writers and scholars in the university, who, upon the fading of the great poet critics of the 1940s and 50s from the leading edge of literary scholarship, came to seem divided by their shared object, literature, even as their offices were still often found side to side in the same hallways. In a review of the program era that became the basis of the book MFA versus NYC, The Two Cultures of American Fiction, Chad Harbach calls McGurl's study of MFA programs an official report from across the hallway, from the English department proper, forcing the aspiring novelist to look across that hallway and notice a bunch of graduate students and professors. And then just a few weeks ago, in a kind of alarmist and overheated New Yorker piece on the end of the English major, Nathan Heller ironizes the corroded infrastructure of Harvard University's English department by paying a visit to the school's lavishly funded new engineering complex next door, where he writes, "Wandering the building's hallways is a 6-mile walk." So I started to wonder why everyone was talking so much about hallways. The interior architecture of the campus English department began to seem like a potent metaphor for the perceived smallness and dividedness of the contemporary literary landscape, like this dimly lit and begrudgingly shared zone through which you hurry before arriving at what Nietzsche calls the nook in which the scholar sits and spins. By the third or fourth time I encountered a theorist of the writer-critic split, describing a departmental hallway, I was reminded of one of this decade's great fictional accounts of academic literary life so far by Christine Smallwood, who I think is one of our finest multi-hyphenate novelist critics. In her book, The Life of the Mind, so good. Smallwood's precarious adjunct narrator bitterly observes a classmate from grad school who's become a tenure-track rising star and whose research focuses on the role of doors in Victorian fiction. It's a great satirical novel. The narrator identifies doors as a cartoonishly obvious cipher for her classmate's careerism and irritating professional luck. This is a quote. "Without doors, there would be no corner offices," the narrator thinks to herself. Doors had to do with opacity, listening behind, peering through. And of course it mattered how hard they were shut and on whom. But Alexandra, the classmate, had never had a door shut in her face, and now she was publishing a book. On the other side of every door, of course, is a hallway, and this was somehow where the literature kept leading me. But it's been some time since I found myself in a university English department or their hallways. I currently work at a small magazine, N+1, which is based in New York, and unlike a lot of American literary magazines, is happily unaffiliated with any university. We're a nonprofit. But this job does sometimes involve encounters with the university's offshoots. Last month, for work, I went to the annual conference of the Association of Writers and Writing Programs, which is the US's big professional organization of MFA faculty members and students, plus also some like independent writers. I don't really know where they go. This conference, which is called AWP, functions as both a networking opportunity for MFA students and as a big marketplace for magazines. And N+1 sends some staff every year to sell copies of the magazine, meet other publications and presses, and interface with thousands of people who are trying, and in many cases paying great sums, to learn to be creative writers. So this is sort of the admin part of my job. A colleague and I spent 3 days tabling in the basement of an enormous convention center in Seattle, Washington, lined up alongside hundreds of other exhibitors' booths. Sometimes between sales, I'd leave the booth and take a long walk through this winding exhibition hall, taking note of all the institutions that had gathered there to display their products. Little magazines I'd read or heard of, littler magazines I hadn't, university presses, poetry presses, flash fiction presses, book art studios, funded MFA programs, and many more unfunded MFA programs. was on one of these walks, passing through aisle after aisle, stuffed with what felt like the near totality of contemporary literary production from the US, that I was struck by the spatial novelty of this arrangement. Consolidated here were not just creative writing programs and their student consumers, but also the minor but sprawling commercial apparatus of magazines, periodicals, and small presses for which those programs train their students to write, all in one long hallway. In the program era, McGurl uses membership data from AWP, this organization, to demonstrate the explosive increase in degree granting programs of creative writing since the post-war period. And he writes that the association's founding in 1967 represented an important moment of professional consolidation in the history of creative writing programs. This professional consolidation and growth, McGurl argues, was the singular most influential force on American literature in the 20th century. And he writes that the vast majority of it is stamped with the influence of the workshop environment in all kinds of latent and manifest ways. But while his analysis really inventively decodes post-war fiction's complex indebtedness to the institutionalization of fiction, he ends up remaining more focused on universities, where, in the latter half of the last century, really radical new fictional styles emerged from, he argues, the coexistence of writing workshops with such things as continental philosophy tracks, R&D labs, and cohorts of newly upwardly mobile students eager to write stories about their family backgrounds. He's more focused on that environment than on the publishing institutions beyond the campus edge. So I want to linger with this image of AWP and to consider it tentatively as a space as contemporarily paradigmatic for the writer-critic divide as anything one might find in a university. So if the 20th century's vexed ecosystem of publicly affiliated, exquisitely productive, and increasingly balkanized programs of theory and craft could be summed up by this image of the English department hallway, then I think a lot about the state of small-scale literary production today, the forces that beset it and that could potentially repair it, are visible in the allegorical scene of this publishing conference, where we have hundreds of presses and magazines, all of them on the margins of Big Five publishing, gathered in the basement of one privately owned convention center. And then 3 blocks away, across a downtown business district that's still pretty hollowed out by COVID, there's the global head of Amazon, the company that McGurl, in a newer book, writes as this century's most consequential actor in the production and distribution of literature. And then everywhere there's like 15,000 aspiring writers strolling around, attending panels on technique, buying books, always making the same joke about how they have no money to buy books, hoping desperately to meet an agent or an editor or a marketing manager who could help them shepherd their work into a publishing ecosystem shaped by deep austerity and winner-take-all economic logic. I wanted to know what we could see in this scene. So, small magazines, by which I mean publications like N+1 and many peers that publish literary work, perhaps alongside other kinds of writing, and MFAs, by which I mean the US's vast ecosystem of degree-granting programs in fiction writing, poetry, and increasingly creative nonfiction, some of which are free and then some of which can cost like $100,000, are 2 of the more consequential institutions for the production and training of new writers. I say consequential and not like large, because I think actually small magazines don't have any money, but they are important in a sort of trickle-up way. But they don't often gather under one roof. They're representatives, while sometimes having a foot in both worlds. Obviously, tons of people with MFAs end up working at literary magazines, and many magazine editors and writers have teaching posts, are in fact usually on opposite sides of the slush pile, or the editorial correspondence, or the publication contract. And they have incentives that are often distinctly unaligned. And I should add that this split is pretty much the direct subject of MFA versus NYC, the anthology by Chad Harbach, who's one of the magazine's founding editors. But while he's more interested in the figure of the kind of writer-teacher, the MFA instructor, whose writerly work is subsidized by their teaching, I'm kind of more interested in the writer-student customer, actually. But MFA versus NYC was very helpful for this. So at the conference, there was this particular encounter I had probably 400 or 500 times during what I started to think of as my sociological report from the field. The encounter begins with an aspiring writer approaching the booth, manuscript in hand. Hovering over a table full of experimental fiction, first-person political writing, and Russian dissident journalism, the student asks, Do you publish tertserimas? Or do you publish historical young adult fiction? No, the magazine representative might say, with the sense that the student has been instructed by some kind of career center to make this ask. We mostly publish fiction and essays and literary journalism. Maybe you'd like to buy a copy of the magazine and see if it suits you. And then as often as not, the student really does make a purchase. This maneuver from one kind of vulnerable transaction into a different and certainly less vulnerable kind is basically our entire money-making strategy at this event. And it really doesn't feel very good, but it does work. So what are these two non-academic institutions that exist for supporting writers? That is formal training in the form of the MFA and small-scale publishing in the form of the independent magazine want from each other, and why is it that they can't often quite manage to get it? Within this encounter, I think we see a whole ecosystem of clashing desires, economic incentives, and sensibilities. And I don't really mean stylistic or generic sensibilities. I think it's true that the explosive size and diversity of the MFA apparatus means that you really can't generalize about what people are actually writing in the workshop system, although many people like to try. But yeah, just anecdotally, I heard from really bright and often lovely writers about plenty of projects that sounded basically unlike any workshop cliches I've ever encountered, including a book-length journalistic project about inequalities in health insurance, a long essay about the tech industry's takeover of Bali, and a fascinating sounding work of systems fiction about the real-life inventor of the strobe light, who apparently also helped invent the atomic bomb. So yeah, all that's to say that I withhold any judgment about the literary output of the MFA system. And indeed came away from AWP feeling like I'd be happy to publish plenty of what I heard about, most notably the strobe light story. But what I mean rather when I say clashing incentives is maybe something closer to ideology. It seems clear that these institutions, far from offering a temporary haven in which to practice the unalienated labor of art making, in fact, end up producing pretty mercenary subjects. And I got the sense that this happens in a pretty top-down way, in which MFA programs teach students to relate to and discuss their work in particular ways. And those ways, I noticed, sort of end up in falling under two tendencies. One being a sort of self-promotional streak that ended up striking me as kind of highly learned, and two, a way of discussing one's own work that felt sort of canonless or ahistorical. And I apologize if my bottom-up report feels a little bit mean, but these were unavoidable facts, just over and over. So I'll go through both. The tendency towards self-promotion, I think, is apparent in this anecdote. We can imagine how an ethos of self-advocacy veering towards self-marketing might naturally emerge from the operational paradox of the workshop system, which McGurl summarizes as, quote, a commitment to the importance of individual creativity, immediately surrounded within the dubious trappings of institutionality. How do you learn to present your individual self-expression to a room full of peers with whom you're in implicit competition and whose personal taste you might not even trust? Probably with some amount of entrepreneurial self-interest. And then we can also imagine a reasonable anxiety here about the student's unavoidable role as customer in the pay-to-play MFA system, and an attendant sort of cruel optimism about the potential to invert the labor relation and sell the commodity, the writing, that you've likely paid to produce. And then alongside this self-promotional streak, the other thing I noticed from my one-woman sociological survey was this repeated non-engagement with the history of the form. It's definitely not true that people don't read in MFA programs. Most programs require some assignment-heavy craft classes, and a true program era veteran might even start to notice the stamp of particular instructors on particular syllabi. The other day I was talking to somebody who's like a generation older than me and had taken a graduate seminar with an MFA class with the novelist Rick Moody, who is the teacher of the one and only fiction workshop I took as an undergraduate. And we found out that we'd both been assigned the same really unlikely book, Amos Tutuola's The Palm Wine Drinkard. Great book. But we were like, that's a classic Moody text. But it is frequently the case that aspiring writers aren't taught literary history in any sort of schematic way. And again, I think this can be felt even just in this strange, omnidirectionally transactional anecdote that I have relayed. What I mean is that, maybe just due to a sort of generalized anxiety of influence, this is a powerfully unreferential crowd. When pitching their work, nobody says, I'm trying out a modern spin on language poetry. They say, my practice involves placing letters on the page in order to obscure their signifying function. Nobody says, my work's indebted to Maggie Nelson. They say, my thesis is a constellation of autoethnographic fragments about queerness. We know there's good versions of this. But there was really an awful lot of talk about constellations this year. It's seemingly one of those new terms that get thrown around every once in a while. It was a lofty term that nobody could really define, but that seemed to involve some associative thinking, maybe without very much argument. Never mind that constellations, as in the celestial phenomena, were always a template for illustrating civilization's oldest shared tropes. Hearing it last month, the term sounded to me like a symptom of the program era's most ahistorical inability to train aspiring writers in the traditions in which they hope to practice. What I kept thinking, probably under the subconscious influence of the sinister Amazon headquarters down the street, was that every student sort of sounded like a tiny venture capitalist, really insulated from the market and then perpetually inventing objects that already exist. I was reminded yesterday when we were talking about the word for writer being the same word as creator, of Raymond Williams' entry in Keywords for the word creative, where he tracks the word's origins from the biblical, as in divine creation, into its mid-century usage to refer to people who work in advertising agencies. I'm a creative director. And it occurred to me that creative writing, the creative in creative writing, at least as it's taught in the US, can lean closer to the latter than toward the former, which I think is a shame. And I'll be honest and say that my instinct from the magazine publisher side of the table was initially to balk at a lot of this, not so much as a failure of students, but as a failure of institutions, which you really do start to feel ought to teach their students that people have been writing autoethnographically for a long time, and to clarify that critics have given names to that form, and maybe to slip the curious student a couple books by Frantz Fanon. And my initial feeling also was that these failures feel maybe unique to institutionalized and privatized pre-professional programs in writing, and not, for instance, to the independent publishing side of things. And actually reading John Goulery's new book about the formation of literary study recently, classic, I read it so you don't have to situation, I started to think that maybe the divergent sensibilities that I kept noticing at AWP between MFAs and the literary magazines that they putatively direct students toward could almost be conceived of as outgrowths of two separate moments in the evolution of scholarly literary studies, which is, of course, a domain that both institutions remain sort of close to, if obviously outside of. So the MFAs we know today, for its part, emerged in part out of early pedagogical attempts to teach composition to an emergent class of professional managerial workers who needed to be decent writers in order to have jobs. This is all kind of from the Goulery, which I found pretty useful. Indirectly, the progressive educational form of the theme, that sort of proto-personal essay that also laid the groundwork for modern forms like the college admissions essay, established a blueprint for a whole track of study in which self-knowledge and self-expression were valued above the other kinds of inquiry that jostled for space in formal literary studies early days, above, that is, like an understanding of rhetoric or philology or a belletristic facility with aesthetic criticism. As for the small magazines, which aren't without their own streak of belletrism, I was struck by an argument that Goulery makes about the present crises that face English scholarship, including the financialization of the university, cratered job markets, skyrocketing labor casualization, and right-wing assaults on humanities syllabi. According to Goulery, the trouble for English began in the 60s, when due to both the importation of theory into the US Academy, as well as a growing curiosity about new media forms, literary studies' object of study ceased to be strictly literature, and its practitioners instead began applying their new interpretive methods to all kinds of non-literary phenomena. So cinema, art, personal identity, political regimes, and then finally the totality of society become available terrain for, Marxist and deconstructionist exegesis. This widening of the aperture has surely been felt by all of us, maybe not even in an unwelcome way, but Goulery asserts that it was disastrous for the originating project of studying novels and poetry with any kind of specialization. A door was opened, leading beyond literature to all of culture, he writes. But having passed through this magic portal, it was difficult to return to literature, to be content with that object. In the nonprofit world, we have an ugly term for this kind of magic portal. We'd call it mission creep. But whether or not the gradual tilt of literary criticism away from the literary and toward just criticism was in fact damaging for the field of study, it has undeniably produced new kinds of writer critics who have in turn required new venues and pathways and institutions. This, of course, brings me back to the small magazine, a number of which, including N+1, have sprung up in the past couple of decades to greet exactly the critics of all of culture that Goury ambivalently describes. After all, the notion that the totality of social and political life might be subject to literary interpretation, or more gently, that certain kinds of literary critical inquiry might offer useful lenses through which to view the non-literary, has basically been the operating premise of political journals since well before English even solidified itself as a discipline in the early 20th century. And the present-day iterations of those journals have been especially enabling for the many people for whom critical specialization has failed to pay off in the academic job market. In N+1, for example, just in the past couple of years, and of course in addition to all kinds of work by non-academics, we've published writing by literary scholars and graduate students, and also credentialed people who never found jobs, about the NBA, Twitter, the Cultural Revolution in China, and psychoanalysis, more than once. Not to mention the occasional experiment in fiction by scholars of literature. I think it's good news that publications exist to house this kind of critic of everything model, and I do believe pretty strongly that if there's a future for the writer-critic in the present day, it will begin in spaces like small magazines, spaces where writers are not just able but encouraged to try out new forms and subject matters, to take unusual assignments with sideways relationships to their expertise, and to send over their secret short story experiments, which everyone sort of has, and then also to be read alongside other writers with different specializations, generic attachments, and political commitments. I really think that sort of expansive table of contents model where you can read, a short story and then a long political essay is elevates both things. So that's the mission. And of course, there does remain for a lucky few a well-worn path from the small magazine to a sustainable writing career. A trajectory we can see in the lives of figures from James Baldwin, who, before he wrote books, had a small magazine of his own called Generation, to Mary McCarthy, to Pankaj Mishra. You begin your intellectual life, on the farm teams of the little magazines, and graduate eventually to the larger book reviews and periodicals, where you maybe write critically about literature or politics while probably holding some kind of day job. And then eventually you enter the big leagues of conglomerate book publishing. Maybe you finally greet the market with the creative work you've been aspiring toward all along. This is the kind of rare trajectory that, as a small magazine editor, one desperately wishes to support. And again, it really is one possible life for the contemporary writer-critic, especially in our bewildering winner-take-all publishing environment that will sometimes throw $500,000 at a debut novel, even one by a weird leftist. Some of my favorite writers of American fiction over the past 2 decades have emerged from small magazine cohorts. Elif Batuman, Chad Harbach, Ben Kunkel, and Christine Smallwood, who I quoted earlier, all wrote criticism for N+1 before they wrote novels. The queer novelists Andrea Lawler and Brontes Purnell emerged from truly small or minor DIY zine communities. Ben Lerner, who I think really writes very stellar art and poetry criticism alongside his fiction, held an early job as an editor for the British intellectual journal Critical Quarterly, a role he briefly dramatizes in his novel 1004. And just as an aside, I think you could even make the case that the normative popularity of autofiction, as it's practiced by the above and other writers, could be said to reflect a kind of small magazine-adjacent sensibility toward literature that contains essayistic tendencies, ekphrasis, and a self-reflexive relationship to artistic production. That is, in elements lifted from criticism, elevated to stand side by side with fiction. But such a path, of course, is exceedingly rare, and the path of the professionalized small magazine writer, and carries with it the threat of deforming careerism. So to what extent does this kind of writing model actually present a corrective to the structural problems I kept witnessing among the MFAs? Certainly it's true that many of the above writers, even the ones who were never trained in any specialized literary path, are writing into established traditions, often because they're widely read, but also simply by virtue of working in the small magazine form. After all, one function of an editor is to let a writer know that they sadly have not invented a whole new literary genre, and to communicate that, no, we won't be establishing a new constellations section of the table of contents just for you. Sad. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it felt that while the granularities of their sensibilities and ideologies might diverge, the MFA program and the ambitious little magazine are institutional formations that writers move through in weirdly similar ways. Both, of course, are generally not especially profitable and perpetually in search of money, although crucially magazines get their money from readers, and writing programs for the most part get their money from the writers. Both also are shaped by the invisible influence of Big Five publishing, which exerts a gravitational pull on writers and their sensibilities that neither program nor magazine can quite teach or edit against, no matter how aggressive their house styles. And then, most importantly for me, for both magazine and writing program, the felt relationship between institution and writer is vexed. Both institutions, of course, offer a tremendous, almost utopian amount of support and community to the early career writer, from programs in the form of time and space to write, from magazines in the form of readership, editorial support, and advocacy in the form of promotion and introductions to agents and that sort of thing. But both also centrally are really needy. They can't sustain that support forever. The obvious limiting factor about small magazines is that the money is small too. And Plus One pays $1,500 for print writing by returning contributors. And so to make a living writing at that scale, you'd have to write about 45 N Plus One essays annually. Of course, the magazine, like its peers, comes out 3 times a year. The math just doesn't add up. Thus, the pull of the trajectory sketched above, from small magazine to real job. But the thing about that path is that it's a trade-off for both parties. When a writer outgrows her small magazine, it can feel like a real loss for the publication, which on one hand has happily launched another career, and on the other hand has lost a good contributor to the Times Book Review, or the New Yorker, or a 3-year book leave. And that same sort of career advancement can be as well a loss for the writer, who almost always leaves behind some of the formal freedom she was afforded in the little magazine space. It can feel almost psychoanalytic, the institution requiring the writer's presence just as much as the writer requires the institution's care until the writer can enter the world securely. I was thinking about this recently, hanging out with some friends, and one of my friends' new baby, and everyone was like surrounding the baby, and the vibe was like, please love me, and I feel that that's how it can feel to be edited by committee. Writing programs, of course, depend less on individual students than publications do on individual writers, but they're needy in their own way, chiefly for tuition and graduate labor. And the sense of loss, at least for the writer, I think bears a structural resemblance. You lose a secure environment in which to experiment, a guaranteed audience for your writing, and a certain amount of pedagogical mentorship or editorial guidance. To have all this briefly while knowing that any kind of success means you can't have it forever is, I think, a heartbreaking paradox, and one that, pretty unsurprisingly, has produced a lot of thoughtful work from both sides of the table. So maybe these two sides, despite my adversarial anecdote, aren't quite so opposed. Both are spaces where the individual rubs up ambivalently against institutionality. Both are needy places that require the writer to sacrifice some amount of individual gain or freedom. But of course, despite their structural similarities, these institutional formations occupy really different life cycles, really different places in the life cycle of the aspiring writer. Everything I've said about the sacrifices made by magazine contributors applies, after all, only to those who have already found themselves in the lucky position of being affiliated with the publication in the first place, no matter the money. And that's where the real trouble begins. It is simply the case that the American program era is producing aspiring writers in greater quantities than any publishing apparatus, literary, critical, or otherwise, can accommodate. What AWP demonstrates above all else by gathering all these many thousands of people in one cavernous room is the impossible scale of the program era. From either side of the table, you're inevitably forced with this kind of vertiginous feeling, staring down the aisles of professional and aspirationally professional writers and their accumulated work. The amount of written material in the room seems nearly limitless, and once again, one senses the looming shadow of Amazon, whose fulfillment centers look quite a lot like this. It's hard not to look out at this stadium-sized exhibition hall and feel, in the end, that gathering most of the country's MFA candidates in one place is a uniquely cruel thing to do. How could an aspiring writer look out at the absurd quantity of people with whom he's ultimately in competition, all trying to sell their books to publishers who are in turn only trying to sell their books, and not feel a crushing sense of austerity, smallness, and loss? A sense that the supply of writers created by the program era will always outpace the demand, and that for most of these people, their aspirations to write will lead to nothing other than debt. It's a very sad scene. But maybe that's not the only way to feel. It was only on the final day of the conference, after speaking with a nice young guy who's writing his nonfiction MFA thesis about mutual aid communities in the state where he's a student. That's sort of an exception from the usual highly depoliticized subjects of creative nonfiction, but certainly not a singular one, that I remembered another architectural fact about this enormous and depressing privatized hallway. The Seattle Convention Center was where in 1999, as we know, the World Trade Organization met to inaugurate a round of trade negotiations for the coming millennium, and where, of course, dozens of thousands of protesters gathered to demonstrate against a future shaped by corporate capture, the triumph of marketing over everything, and a world system in which the whims of a select American few would determine the fate of the global many. These are now the realities that today's independent publishing projects can't not contend with, and they're the essential obstacles that stand in the way of unifying a creative life with a politically critical one. Suddenly they're in the convention center, the swarm of bodies jostling for their slice of a narrow attention economy briefly looked less like a heartbreaking surplus of talent and ambition and more like the sort of crowd to whom, as DeLillo wrote, the future belongs. For a brief moment, I entertained a powerful fantasy. I had this kind of psychedelic moment of imagining a kind of present-day Battle of Seattle, improbably helmed by shy writers and underpaid magazine workers, all taking to the streets to demand better conditions, less expensive writing programs, each with more expansive groundings in histories of the form, more free workshop settings anchored in spaces outside of universities, in which writing can be practiced for its own sake and not as a way of delaying one's entry into a hostile labor market, more money for people writing weird and ambitious and politically challenging work, more places to publish said work, and finally a big publishing ecosystem that materially supports the small outlets it draws from, rather than letting them sink, as they keep doing. I thought of the role of alternative media in fomenting the 1999 demonstration, the underground zines and newspapers that united a broad coalition of labor organizations and student groups, the larger activist publications like Adbusters, that lifted those concerns out of the fringe. This, to me, is the ultimate function of the Writer-Critic, the task that I do think little magazines are, in the best cases, poised to support, to create work that is never without a recognition of the conditions of its own production. Obviously, it didn't transpire that 15,000 MFA candidates and magazine salespeople took to the streets. Sad. But it is the case that both American publishing and American academia, the two umbrellas to which small magazines and MFAs are adjacent, have recently been shaken by transformative movements of organized labor, movements in which publishing workers and graduate workers alike have aligned themselves with a labor movement that has not always been embraced by white-collar professions. These new alignments have been tectonic and have emerged in happy tandem. Just this past winter, you could walk a straight line through Manhattan and pass by actions both by the unionized New School faculty and by the workers at HarperCollins who struck for 3 whole months to raise salary floors for publishing workers. The program era, for better or for worse, has furnished us with a robust and highly imperfect apparatus of institutional affiliations and organizations. The retreat of creative writing toward institutionalization has brought with it countless practical and aesthetic hurdles, from mass debt to rampant careerism, to the unfortunate rise of the memoir in fragments. But institutions, as in literal spaces where people come in sustained contact with each other, the kind that neoliberalism has done its part to wipe out, are precisely where solidarity begins. I saw a glimmer of this briefly at AWP when, out to drinks with a Friends MFA cohort, all the women in the cohort began talking about their experiences with this kind of handsy professor. Nothing happened, but I was like, this is why we are all hanging out. Not to critique each other's writing, but to get here. Guillory's lament that by turning its gaze to all of society, literary studies has left literature to wither, neglects the more immediate possibilities opened up by such an inversion of the critical gaze. After all, if a graduate student or an adjunct instructor finds it less exciting to perform a Marxist reading of the campus politics in Maurice than to perform a Marxist reading of her labor value on her own campus, it's probably the case that the problem isn't Forster. In any case, it's just as likely that our hypothetical graduate student is doing both, teaching here, organizing there, maybe writing for periodicals during her shreds of free time. Again, the one piece of good news is that there do remain places to do that. The little magazine, as part of what Guillory calls an emergent, semi-autonomous professional sphere, has seen a flourishing of what the critic Nick Dames, in a review of the Guillory, calls a more directly politicized form of criticism, increasingly inspired by the direct action of labor organizing. And what about the MFAs? I think they too could take a cue from their future comrades across the table in publishing and their current comrades down the hall in PhD programs. At some universities where MFA students are enlisted to teach, graduate writing students are classified as unionizable workers, and at many they're not. I hope that the coming years will see a reckoning with that fact and an increased alignment, when possible, between the writer-worker customers of the program era and the academic and publishing spheres they're caught between. I think such an alignment would improve everyone's lives and probably also their writing. Thanks.
That was insightful, enjoyable at the same time. Many thoughts in my head. I'll just say something quickly about. You mentioned the publishing ecosystem, and this has been sort of not just in America but elsewhere. It's been shaped by commercial interests entirely, whether it's the academy or the publishers, or even the magazines. So I was thinking about the role the writer plays. Looking at the history of the little magazine, one keeps coming across examples of writers, young writers as well as writers who had an established body of work behind them, attaching themselves to magazines. So poetry had Ezra Pound, Little Review had Pound as well. Eliot had his Criterion, Cyril Connolly had Horizon, just to stay within the Anglo-American sphere. But even outside, in Paris and Berlin, in India, in North India, in the Hindi language, whole movements formed around magazine. And sometimes, the new story and the new poem in Hindi, these movements were formed around magazines with the same name. So do you see that happening in your experience? Do you see this kind of... Are writers receptive to this idea of attaching themselves, affiliating themselves with little magazines?
I think, can you hear me? I think younger writers are, emerging writers are. Again, I think that the sort of like vulgar and utilitarian understanding is that that an affiliation with a small magazine can be very helpful at the beginning of a career, and then kind of can shrink the world after a little while. I think that, yeah, in every case, I think like these magazines can play a tremendous social role in like bringing a cohort together or something. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the contemporary careerist drive to get from first byline to bigger byline to book deal. But it's always my hope to kind of keep writers around for longer, or to form more durable attachments, shaped less by austerity and more by just like a shared mutual editorial sensibility or something.
Great. I don't want to impinge upon the time the audience might have to ask questions. So does anyone have any questions or comments? Yeah, over there.
Thank you for your talk, Lisa. I'm Aditya from English department. I'm doing my master's at Ashoka University. And what I found most interesting was the idea, that, as Vineet also mentioned, of affiliation. But I'm thinking of affiliation mostly as affiliation to a certain tradition or a certain writer poet of some kind, because I mostly work with Hindi fiction, but even the most contemporary voices currently in Hindi, for example, I mean Red Samadhi that won the Booker, also have a certain sense of acknowledgement of a literary inheritance. So, Geetanjali, she would refer to Krishna Sopti in her dedication to the book. So, what is the, how do you think has that emerged or sort of, gone away in the US scene? And how do you think that impacts a writer's work, in the sense how they see this inheritance? And sometimes it might not be, it might also be a crafted inheritance, as in it might not be just borrowing a form, but attaching yourself to a name or a person as inspiration without necessarily borrowing their form. So I'm thinking about inheritance in both ways. And how do you think that shapes a writer's life also, not just writing?
Right. That's a great question. Yeah, I think we could sort of see it in both of these spheres, right? In creative writing, you might have a teacher who's particularly seductive or contagious and begin to write like them. I think also something about the workshop environment can incentivize that sort of gradual writing to your instructor's taste, for better or for worse. In this David Foster Wallace essay I quote, he takes a hard stance against this. He says that the system of having kind of star or emerging star workshop instructors means that everyone just tries to ape their teachers, and that this is like extremely destructive for young writers whose voices otherwise might be like easier to access. I think in the little magazine sphere, I mean, certainly I think, when I write for N+1 or work with a writer, often the first things I'll read or send a writer are previous N+1 pieces, right? And I think magazines with even longer lifespans, I think like when you read something in Dissent, which has existed, I think, since the 60s, the best pieces in Dissent are channeling the entire canon of Dissent before them. That's with a capital D. So yeah, I think a magazine can kind of construct its own tradition in which to write into. And I think sometimes that's like very freeing and liberating, and then sometimes you end up reading submissions that feel like pastiche almost. Yeah.
Thanks very much. I have a question about how you view a certain strange disparity that one observes, at least in the U.S. So on the one hand, there are all of these stories about, and correct stories, about the implosion of the humanities, whether it's Guillory's book or the Heller piece that you referred to. And the numbers certainly seem to justify some of the alarm around that. But on the other, your account of this burgeoning scene of the creative writers where everybody's, thousands of people are running around trying to sell what, or at least have published what they've written. So how do these two stories go together?
I think it's complicated. I think you could almost say that and this is basically what the Mark McGurl book is about, but that as English has maybe shrunk or turned toward self-reflexivity, in the form of post-critique or these kinds of increasing impulses to for English to study English, that MFA programs began to emerge in parallel, often as kind of cash cows for the same institutions whose humanities were otherwise dragging them down. Obviously not cash cows in the same order of magnitude as, for example, the engineering department at Harvard, but I think, it just is the case that an unfunded MFA is extremely profitable for university in a way that having a cohort of 10 brilliant English PhD students isn't, simply because you take money from some of them and yeah.
But it's not just a question of the money that is made available, though that's important, but it's also the demand. So it's clear that the cachet of being a humanities major has lessened, so that even people who are interested are embarrassed to sign up to be a history or an English major because they would lose face with their friends who think that that's just a bad choice to make. You're dumb to have done that because there are such clever things to do. So it's not just being directed from above somehow, but the students are voting themselves. So you see what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And yet they're also voting to be published writers and poets. So they are interested clearly in that world of meaning, but in a different mode, as producers rather than just as readers.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, I guess I wonder to what extent the kind of like decline in cachet is actually bottom up, or to what extent it's just like students feeling in large part that that they like have to get jobs and won't be able to if they pursue what they like. I suspect that ultimately when it comes to the MFAs that it's ultimately all part of the same relatively small system of people who studied English or American studies or whatever in the first place. That there are not so many people who are making great leaps from, you know, STEM or stockbroking or something into creative writing. Although maybe there are some people who are doing that. Maybe people go work at Goldman Sachs for 5 years in order to pay for their MFA. That'd be very savvy. But it's an interesting question that I'm not quite sure how to think about.
As I was listening to you speak, I couldn't help but this little track that was playing in my head of Maya Angelou reciting "Still I Rise." And I mean, as a person who inhabits the academy periodically, my friends outside the academy ask me, how do you do it? How do you survive? And sometimes I tell them barely, and sometimes I tell them very poorly. But having followed the work that N+1 does, I'm curious to ask you, I'm really curious about how you go about forming this sense of a writerly and a readerly community. And I know you addressed that a little bit, but I'd like you to speak a little more about that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways I think that's like the most valuable thing a publication can do, more than publishing exceptional work. Sometimes I'm like, I'll publish a medium thing if it means that there's a new person in the fold who I think is interesting in some way. Lately, so I have a very literal answer, which is that lately we've started doing these sort of like pedagogical workshops for young people in New York who are interested in learning how to edit. And this has felt like a tremendous new way of getting people interested and keeping them around and like really providing a service to youngish people who otherwise like don't quite have professional trajectories straight into that kind of work or knowledge production. But I think otherwise, you know, I think really just like cultivating some goodwill can go a long way, you know, rejecting people kindly or editing people gently, or promoting a writer's book after, you know, promoting a contributor's book and doing something to kind of chip in even when it's not like immediately, even when there's no like immediate financial gain for the institution. All of those things can feel like ways of building community.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, first just a comment. You mentioned the metaphor of the hallway. Did you realize that you mentioned a cave midway as well? You used the word cavernas, and we were discussing the allegory of the
You're
cave
right,
last
you're right.
night. Yeah.
I wish I forgot to look at A Room of One's Own for mention of a hallway, but hearing this talk, I suspect she talks about one.
You just mentioned a little while ago in response, I think, to Vineet's question about when you begin working with a writer, you often send them copies of previous issues of N+1 or ask them to read their essays, read the essays published. I guess this is to give a sense of what N+1 stands for or publishes. For so many of us who get this kind of template, we enjoyed reading this a lot, but this is not for us. So how does a magazine grow if a writer does not write what is really an N+1 kind of essay? it's not just about the writer managing to get published, but also the expansion of the N+1 vision.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, this, to me, I think this is like the major big picture question that I think about often is, how to not just iterate, but also like move in new directions in ways that don't feel like a radical break. You know, I think, I've looked a lot at sort of the history of N+1 and its origins in publishing basically only this group of 4 or 5 white American guys who were obsessed with Jonathan Franzen. I also love Jonathan Franzen. But there was this very slow, like, cosmopolitanization of the magazine that occurred after its first couple of years. It took a really strong feminist turn after some new editors came in. Then a couple years later, I think we started publishing, like, pretty interventionist writing by trans writers, too. And each of those sort of stages has felt like a challenge, to what initially was the old guard. But I think each one has been very positive. So I think, bringing in new editors with new sensibilities and networks can go really far in that sort of growth. But also, just trusting that, trusting and understanding that any institution can't just shrink or even just like self-sustain. Yeah, is important. That's a great question.
So do we have one more?
Lisa, in India, most of the writers live a very petty life because they are not paid properly. And in case of academic, a author has to pay for it. And nowadays, many books are being published by author itself, or they are paying to publish it. So how this revenue model is going to happen?
Sorry, can you repeat the last?
Revenue. How to generate revenue for writer or the publisher or the market?
Your thoughts on the self-publishing revolution?
Yeah, this is very interesting to me. At least in the U.S. context, I think self-publishing has undergone like a really radical shift since the 90s. I got really interested a couple years ago in what self-publishing meant in a sort of like minor literature of like zine and early internet writing. There was all this really DIY publishing that came up from like punk communities that I think was in many cases really fun. And then that became harder and harder to sustain, and now self-publishing has essentially been eaten by the Amazon model of like publishing with KDP. And Mark McGurl's his most recent book, Everything and Less, is this incredible study of, he reads like probably like 500 self-published books on Amazon as these like encodings of the Amazon economic logic. I think his book is a really like, it's a very reparative corrective to the to certain cliches about self-publishing as maybe a little bit bottom of the barrel or something. He makes the case that a lot of like tremendously creative work that's outsider in some way is being produced through those channels, even like in the wake of the zine collapse. So that's my report from the U.S. I think it's very nice to have the backing of a major publisher, and I also think, as I said, that can be very deforming in certain ways.
Thank you, Lisa.